Monica Hayes had $214 in her bank account. She knew the exact number because she had checked it 3 times that morning, the way people check a wound they already know is bad, hoping each glance will somehow change what they see. It never did. $214, and the rent was due in 8 days. 8 days felt like nothing when you were exhausted down to the marrow, when your feet ached before you even put your shoes on, when you fell asleep on the bus home so completely that the driver sometimes had to shake your shoulder at the last stop. Monica was 35 years old, and she had learned something quietly painful in those 35 years. Surviving and living were not the same thing, and she had been doing a great deal of surviving. She worked the night shift at Mercy General Hospital in Detroit, a certified nursing assistant who moved through fluorescent hallways with the steady, practiced calm of someone who had learned to keep her feelings folded tight and stored somewhere the patients couldn't reach. She changed dressings and turned patients who couldn't turn themselves. She recorded vital signs at 2 in the morning and answered call lights at 4. She held the hands of frightened people because sometimes that was the only medicine anyone had to offer. The work mattered. She knew the work mattered. But mattering and paying the electricity bill occupied 2 completely different worlds. And most nights, Monica found herself stranded somewhere between them. Her credit card carried a balance she tried not to think about too directly, the kind of number that made the back of her neck go cold if she let it come fully into focus. She had stopped going out for coffee. She had stopped going out at all. After her divorce, 4 years back, she had slowly let the social fabric of her life unravel thread by thread. Not out of bitterness exactly, but out of a tiredness so deep it had become structural, like load-bearing walls you couldn't knock out without the whole house coming down. There had been a time, in her late 20s, when her life had felt open in the way that lives can feel open before circumstances compress them, when there had been plans and possibilities and the easy assumption that things would gradually improve. That time felt very far away now, not with regret exactly, but with the neutral factual distance of a map checked and found accurate. Here is where you are. Here is how you got here. The map did not offer opinions. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Linwood Avenue, a 1-bedroom with a window that let in good light on Sunday mornings, and a radiator that clanged at irregular intervals through the night, like an old man trying to get comfortable. She had a sofa she'd found at a garage sale the year before, a gray thing with one arm that sat slightly lower than the other. And she had covered it with a blanket her mother had crocheted years ago, a blanket in blue and cream that was the warmest-looking thing in the room. She lived alone. She had lived alone long enough now that solitude had stopped feeling like a condition and had started feeling like a climate, just the weather of her particular life, neither good nor bad, simply present. The apartment was tidy in the way that spaces become tidy. When only one person moves through them, every object settled into a permanent location. Nothing displaced, nothing unexpected. She cooked the same rotation of meals each week. She watched television she would not have been able to describe the next morning. She slept in 4-hour stretches and called it rest. And on the evening of the 11th of November, she came home from a 12-hour shift with wet hair because it had started raining on the walk from the bus stop, and she stood in her kitchen eating crackers over the sink because she was too tired to cook and too hungry to wait, and she thought, "This is fine. This is fine." She said it to herself with the quiet determination of someone bailing water from a boat that wasn't sinking fast enough to panic, but wasn't quite staying afloat either. It was 11 o'clock at night when the knock came. She almost didn't answer. She stood very still in the kitchen for a moment, crackers in hand, listening to the sound settle in the hallway. It was a particular kind of knock, not hard and not urgent. 3 measured taps, with what sounded like one knuckle, the knock of someone who did not want to impose but had run out of other options. She set the crackers down on the counter. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole and saw an old man standing in the yellow light of the hallway, soaking wet, his gray coat hanging heavy with rain, his white hair flattened against his forehead. He was not a large man. He was not a frightening man. He was simply old and wet, and standing there with the particular stillness of someone who has been outside a very long time and has stopped expecting anything quick. She opened the door. Not all the way. Enough. He looked at her without surprise, as if he had rehearsed his lines carefully and was simply waiting for his cue. "I'm sorry to bother you at this hour," he said. His voice was low and steady. A voice that had belonged to a larger life once, she thought. A voice that had given instructions and told stories and laughed in crowded rooms. "I'm not looking for money or anything like that. I just wondered if you might know whether any of the shelters nearby are still open this late." He paused. "The one on Grand River was full. The one on Claremont is closed on Tuesdays." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way a man recites the results of a search he has already conducted and accepted. Monica knew the answer before she said it. She had been a nursing assistant in this city for 11 years. She knew which shelters had beds on which nights. She knew the gaps in the system the way you know potholes on a road you drive every day. There was nowhere left open tonight, within reasonable walking distance. The rain outside was getting worse. She could hear it against the window at the end of the hallway. A heavy, insistent sound that made the indoors feel precious in a way it normally didn't. The old man thanked her before she had even finished speaking. He thanked her with the courtliness of someone from another era. A small inclination of the head. A quiet, "I appreciate it." And he turned to go back toward the stairwell. He was already reaching for the railing when Monica heard herself say, "Wait." He turned. "One night," she said. "I have a sofa. You can sleep on my sofa tonight." She did not know, in that moment, why she said it. She would think about that later, would turn it over many times looking for the logic. And she would not find a clean answer. She was tired and broke and alone, and the sensible thing, the careful thing, every safety-conscious instinct she had developed over 35 years of being a woman alone in a city, said to close the door gently and go back to her crackers. But there was something in the way he had said, "I appreciate it," and turned back into the rain. Some combination of dignity and resignation so complete it had moved through her defenses before she could raise them. "Just one night," she said again, as if the repetition made it smaller, more manageable, less like the thing it actually was. "That's very kind of you," he said. "I won't be any trouble." He said it simply, without the desperate gratitude that would have made her uncomfortable, without the elaborate assurances that people sometimes offer when they're trying too hard to seem trustworthy. He just said it, the way you state a fact about yourself you've known a long time. His name was Samuel Brooks. He was 72 years old. He came inside and stood on her doormat while she got him a towel. And he dried his face and his hands with careful, unhurried movements. He was holding a tin box under one arm the entire time. A flat, rectangular thing the size of a shoebox but thinner, with a faded floral pattern on the lid, held closed with a rubber band that had been stretched so many times it had gone gray. He held it against his side with the ease of long habit. The way people carry things they have carried so long, the weight has become invisible to them. He did not put it down. Not when she handed him the towel. Not when she showed him where the bathroom was. Not when she unfolded the blanket on the sofa and told him she was sorry there was no proper guest room. He held the tin box and said everything was perfect, and he sat down on the edge of the sofa and began to remove his wet shoes, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had developed opinions about the speed of things. Monica went to her room and did not sleep for a long time. She lay on her back in the dark listening to the rain and to the small sounds of a stranger settling into her living room. Sounds she had not heard in this apartment before. The faint creak of the sofa, the rustle of the blanket, and she felt, very unexpectedly, something she did not immediately have a name for. Not fear. Not exactly comfort. Something in between, like the feeling of a house before a storm, full of a peculiar electricity, when you don't know yet whether the weather will be beautiful or terrible. In the morning she found the sofa cushions stacked neatly against the arm, the blanket folded with military precision, and the kitchen sink empty of the 2 dishes she had left to soak the night before. They were clean and stacked on the drying rack. Samuel was sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of water, reading a paperback he must have had in his coat pocket, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and said, "Good morning. I hope it's all right that I washed up." It was more than all right. But she didn't say that. She made coffee. He drank his black. He did not ask for breakfast. He did not comment on her apartment, or her furniture, or her life. He finished his chapter and closed his book, and sat with the quiet self-containment of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that his presence in a space was something that required careful management. She noticed he was wearing the same clothes from the night before, dried now but still carrying the creases of a long night. And she noticed that the tin box was on the table beside his water glass. Rubber band still in place, lid still closed. When she left for her shift that afternoon, she told him she would be back by midnight. She did not exactly invite him to stay. She did not exactly ask him to leave. She said, "I'll be back late," and he said, "I understand." And there was something in the exchange that neither of them named but both of them understood. He was still there when she got home. The second day, the kitchen faucet stopped dripping. Monica had been listening to it drip for 6 months. She had reported it to the building manager twice, and been told parts were on order. She stood at the sink and turned the handle, and heard nothing. Just the clean, complete silence of a faucet that worked. She turned to look at Samuel, who was reading in the living room, and he glanced up over the top of his book and said, "The washer was cracked. I found a spare in the toolbox under your sink." He said it with the same tone he used for everything, measured, matter of fact, as if fixing the faucet was simply a reasonable thing to do with one's morning. She sat down across from him. "What did you do?" she asked. "For work, I mean." "Before, master plumber," he said. 41 years. He turned a page. "Retired 6 years ago." Or was retired, depending on how you look at it. That evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Monica cooked a real meal. Not crackers, not cereal. She made pasta with a jar sauce she'd had in the cupboard for weeks, and she made enough for 2, and they ate at the kitchen table, while the rain from the night before had cleared into a sharp, cold clarity, and the window above the sink let in the amber light of a Detroit evening settling into dark. Samuel ate slowly, and complimented the food with the unpretentious sincerity of a man who meant it. He told her about the kind of plumbing work he used to do, the big commercial jobs, the school buildings and hospital wings and the old apartment complexes built in the 1940s, with pipes laid so tightly in the walls that only someone who understood the system completely could ever hope to fix them without tearing everything open. He talked about it the way craftsmen talk about their craft, with a specific, quiet pleasure. The pleasure of a person who had spent their best years getting very good at one difficult thing. She found the cabinet door fixed on Thursday. The lock on the bathroom window, which had stuck for as long as she'd been in the apartment, unstuck itself by Friday morning. A loose hinge on the closet in the hallway was tightened to a firmness she didn't know it had ever had. Samuel did these things without announcement, without asking permission, without presenting them as gifts or gestures. He simply noticed what was broken and fixed it, the way he had been doing for 41 years, because a thing that was fixable shouldn't stay broken if you had the knowledge and the time. There was a wordless integrity to it that Monica recognized from her work. From the nurses she admired most, the ones who did not wait to be asked before adjusting a patient's pillow or refilling a water cup, who understood that attention itself was the work, that noticing and then acting was a complete moral unit that required no additional language. Samuel moved through her apartment with that same quality. He was not performing care. He was simply careful, in the original sense of the word, full of care, shaped by it. Unable to turn it off even when the context was someone else's kitchen, someone else's stuck window, someone else's life, she began to look forward to coming home. This surprised her more than anything. She had not looked forward to coming home in years. The apartment had been a place to sleep and eat and store her things between shifts, functional and unremarkable. Hers in the legal sense, but not in the deeper sense of a place that contained something worth returning to. Now she found herself, on the bus home after midnight, thinking about whether Samuel had eaten, whether the soup had turned out, whether he was still reading, or had already gone to sleep. She found herself, without meaning to. Thinking of the apartment as a place where someone was, they began to talk in the evenings, real conversations. The kind Monica hadn't had in years. Conversations that didn't feel like social performance or professional transaction, but something more fundamental, two people exchanging the actual substance of their lives. He had a way of listening that was rare, completely still, his eyes focused, no restlessness, no preparatory shifting toward his own story before you had finished yours. She told him things she had not said out loud to anyone in a long time, about the divorce, about the specific loneliness of working nights in a place where life and death were constants, while your own life felt like it was standing still, about her mother, who had died 3 years ago, who had been the person she called when anything happened, good or bad, and whose absence had left a silence in Monica's life that no amount of busyness had ever successfully filled. Samuel listened to all of it. When she talked about her mother, something shifted slightly in his face, a deepening of attention so subtle she almost missed it. Like a current moving under still water, he said, "She sounds like someone who understood people." Monica said yes, that was exactly right. Her mother had been that. A woman who understood people in the quiet, practical way that nurses sometimes develop after years of sitting with strangers at the end of their lives. Evelyn Hayes had spent years as a home health aide before her own health had declined. She had cared for people no one else cared for in their final months. She had believed, in a way that was neither naive nor complicated, that being present for another person in their most vulnerable moment was the highest form of work available to a human being. Monica noticed the tin box every day. Samuel carried it with him, or kept it within arm's reach at all times. She never saw him open it in front of her. She did not ask about it. There were things that belonged to people that you simply did not ask about. And the tin box was clearly one of those things. But late on the night of the 7th day, when she had woken at 2 in the morning for no reason she could identify, she came quietly down the hallway and saw, through the gap in the living room door, that Samuel was sitting upright on the sofa with the tin box open on his knees. He was not reading whatever was inside. He was not handling the contents. He was simply sitting with it open, looking down into it. In the way that people look at things that represent the sum of something irreplaceable, his face in the faint light from the window was so still that he looked ancient, older than 72, old in the way that grief makes people old, not in body but in expression, worn down to something essential and bare. Monica went back to her room. She did not say anything about what she had seen, but she lay in her bed afterward and thought about the tin box for a long time. And she thought about the weight of things that people carry through their lives, not metaphorically but literally, the physical objects that become containers for everything that can't be said, everything that happened, everyone who is gone. She thought about the box of her mother's things still in the top of her closet, the one she had never been able to fully go through. And she understood, in a way she could not have articulated neatly, exactly what Samuel had been doing at 2 in the morning on her sofa. On the 12th day, he told her about his wife. Her name had been Dorothy. They had been married for 44 years. She had died of ovarian cancer 2.5 years ago. A slow dying that had taken 14 months from diagnosis to end. And Samuel had spent those 14 months the way he had spent everything, methodically, attentively, with his hands doing whatever work was available. He had retrofitted their bathroom for her when she could no longer use the tub safely. He had built a ramp at the back door. He had learned to cook the foods the doctor recommended and had unlearned the ones that were no longer good for her, adjusting his entire domestic world with the same careful competence he brought to any system that needed to be made to work. And then she had died, and the house had been full of a silence, so absolute that it had felt, he said, like a material thing, like something with density and temperature, something you walked through rather than simply existed in. After Dorothy died, things had come apart in the steady, unglamorous way that things come apart when a person loses the architecture of their daily life. He had sold the house because it was too large and too full. His daughter, Claire, lived in Phoenix with her husband and 2 young children, and she had offered to have him come, and he had gone for 3 months and found himself sitting in their guest room feeling like furniture, feeling like a benign problem they had decided to store in a room at the end of the hall. Not unwanted exactly, but not integrated, not useful, not present in any way that mattered to anyone. He had come back to Detroit. He had found an apartment, and then lost it, when his Parkinson's, early stage and manageable but undeniable, had made his landlord nervous in ways that were not legal, but were very real. He had moved through a sequence of situations, each one a degree smaller and less certain than the last, until the night he had knocked on Monica's door. "I can fix any pipe in this city," he told her. They were sitting on the small balcony off the living room, the city below them quietly lit, a cold November air that was nonetheless bearable if you kept your hands wrapped around something warm. "I understand systems, how water moves, where pressure builds, what fails first, and why." He was quiet for a moment. "But I couldn't figure out how to stop feeling like I was in everyone's way, like I'd used up whatever claim I had to being somewhere." Monica did not say anything for a while. She sat with what he had said, the way she had learned to sit with difficult things at work, not rushing to fill the silence, not offering the easy comfort that was really just discomfort managed. Finally, she said, "You're not in my way." She did not make it large or elaborate. She said it like a fact, because it was one. He looked at her. He nodded once. He looked back at the city. That was the 12th day. On the 13th, the third hinge was tightened. On the 14th, the bathroom light that flickered got a new ballast he'd picked up from the hardware store 2 blocks down, paying with the small reserve of cash he kept in his coat pocket. On the 15th, he made her soup from scratch, the kind that required starting with bones. And when she came home at midnight, the apartment smelled like something that had been cooking all day, warm and substantial and unmistakable. And she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she took her coat off, just standing there in the smell of it, in the specific comfort of coming home to a place that had been attended to in her absence. She would think about that later, the smell of the soup, the quiet evidence of care that had accumulated in her apartment over 2 weeks and some days, the fixed things and the clean things, and the occasional folded newspaper on the kitchen table. She had lived alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like for a space to hold the signs of another person's inhabitation. Not an intrusion, but a presence, the simple proof that someone else was also here. She had not known how much she missed it until it was there. On the 18th morning, she woke to find him gone, not gone in the way of vanishing, not gone without evidence. His blanket was folded. His towel was folded on the bathroom counter. His water glass was washed and placed upside down on the rack. The paperback he had been reading was on the kitchen table, with a folded piece of paper on top of it, and the tin box was gone from its usual spot beside the lamp. She stood in the kitchen in the early morning light and looked at the folded paper and felt something move in her chest before she even picked it up. A slow drop, the physical anticipation of a loss she had not let herself think about clearly until this moment. The note was written in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man whose hands were beginning to disagree with him. Monica, I am not good at goodbyes, and I am not sure this is one. Thank you for the sofa and the pasta and the evenings. You gave me something I did not know how to ask for and did not expect to find. You gave me the feeling of having a home one more time. That is not a small thing. It is in fact everything. Please don't worry about me. I know this city. I'll be all right. Samuel. She read it 3 times. She put it down. She made coffee she did not drink. She went to work that night and moved through her shift with the practiced steadiness of someone who has learned that feelings have their own schedule and will attend to themselves in their own time. She told no one about Samuel. She drove home at midnight and stood in the apartment that was tidy and quiet and smelled faintly of the soup he had made 2 days ago, and she sat on the sofa with the blue and cream blanket around her shoulders, and she missed him with the specific, quiet ache of missing someone who was never quite yours to miss. 3 weeks passed. The faucet stayed silent. The hinges stayed tight. The bathroom light did not flicker. Monica paid half her rent with overtime, and the other half with the credit card, and told herself she would sort it out later, in the way that people in motion keep deferring the things that require stillness. She thought about Samuel often, in the small gaps of her shifts, in the early mornings when she came home and the apartment was exactly as she had left it, every object in its permanent location, nothing displaced, nothing unexpected. She was home on a Wednesday afternoon, sleeping after a night shift, when the knock came. This knock was different from Samuel's knock. It was the knock of someone accustomed to announcing themselves in official settings. 3 firm, evenly spaced taps that sounded like they had been rehearsed in hallways with better carpets than hers. She opened the door to a man in a dark coat with a briefcase and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was around 60, trim and careful-looking, with the particular professional composure of someone who delivers difficult news regularly and has learned to hold their face still while doing it. He said, "Monica Hayes?" She said yes. He said, "My name is Richard Collins. I'm an attorney. I need to speak with you about a man named Samuel Brooks." He paused. "I'm very sorry to tell you that Mr. Brooks passed away 11 days ago." She stood in the doorway and heard his words come through a layer of something dense, the way sound travels when you are underwater, present but altered, reaching you slightly changed from what it was at the source. Samuel was gone. She had known, somewhere she had not examined carefully, that his Parkinson's and his situation and his age were a combination that did not point toward a stable future. But knowing something can be true and not knowing it yet are 2 entirely different conditions, and she had been living in the second one. Richard Collins had been Samuel's attorney for over 20 years. He explained this in the careful, precise way that lawyers explain things, with full sentences and no shortcuts. Samuel had been thorough and organized with his affairs. As it turned out, the way that people who have spent their lives understanding systems often are with the ones they can still control. There was a will. It had been updated 8 months ago, well before the night he had knocked on Monica's door. And in that will, Samuel Brooks had left $45,000 to Monica Hayes, along with the tin box and its contents, and a sealed letter to be given to her after his death. Monica sat down on the couch. She sat down because she needed to. The attorney sat in the chair across from her with the briefcase on his knees and said nothing for a moment, allowing the information to find its level. She said she didn't understand. She said there must be a mistake. She said she had known this man for 18 days. She had let him sleep on her sofa, and he had fixed her faucet. She did not see how she could be in anyone's will, least of all a man she had barely known. The attorney said he understood her confusion. He said there was something she needed to know, something that would explain it. He opened his briefcase. He put the tin box on the coffee table between them. Inside the tin box, Monica found a small leather-bound diary with a red cover, worn thin at the corners. She found 4 photographs, printed on the older, slightly shiny paper of a different era. She found a folded letter in a woman's handwriting, thin and careful, dated 21 years earlier. And she found, in a small clear plastic sleeve, a photograph of her mother. Her mother, at perhaps 40 years old, wearing the gray uniform of a home health aide, standing in a room that Monica did not recognize, smiling at the camera with the direct, unguarded smile that Monica had been missing for 3 years. Richard Collins spoke quietly while she held the photograph. He told her that Samuel's wife, Dorothy, had required full-time home care in the last 8 months of her life, care beyond what Samuel alone could provide. A woman named Evelyn Hayes had been assigned to Dorothy's case and had been with her 3 days a week for those final 8 months. According to Samuel's diary, and according to Dorothy herself in the letter she had written to Samuel a week before she died, Evelyn Hayes had been more than a caretaker. She had been a companion, a reader of books aloud, a keeper of dignity, someone who had treated Dorothy not as a patient managing a decline but as a person completing a life. She had brought music. She had brought food from her own kitchen. She had sat with Dorothy on the hard nights and had not left until the fear had passed, because she understood that fear at the end was real and deserved to be met by a real person. In the letter Dorothy had written to Samuel, she had said, "When you feel alone in the world, remember that there is at least one woman in this city who will sit with you in the dark and not flinch. Find a way to thank her. Find a way to give back some of what she gave me. Evelyn Hayes had died before Samuel could find her. He had spent years, quietly and without urgency, looking for her the way a person looks for something they believe is still out there. Checking periodically. Never giving up, but never making it desperate. When he finally found that Evelyn had a daughter, that she had died 3 years ago, that her daughter Monica was a nursing assistant at Mercy General on Linwood, he had sat with that information for months. He had not known what to do with it. He had understood that showing up and handing money to a stranger was not the same as giving back what her mother had given Dorothy. He was not a man who did things carelessly when they mattered. And then winter had come, and the city had contracted around him the way cities do in November, and the shelter on Grand River had been full, and the one on Claremont was closed, and he had found himself on the 3rd floor of a building on Linwood Avenue, standing outside the door of Evelyn's daughter. And he had knocked the way he knocked, 3 quiet taps, not wanting to impose. He had known who she was before she opened the door. Monica sat with this for a long time. The attorney was quiet. Outside the window, Detroit was doing what it always did, moving forward. Indifferent to the small momentous things happening in apartment buildings and hospital rooms and living rooms along its old grid of streets. She looked at her mother's photograph and thought about her mother sitting with a dying woman in a house she had never seen, reading aloud, staying through the hard nights, doing the work that her mother had always described as the work that mattered most. Simply being present. Simply refusing to let someone face the dark alone. She thought about how her mother had never been dramatic about any of it. Evelyn Hayes had not described her work in terms of sacrifice or heroism. She had described it as common sense. She had said, "If someone is alone and afraid, you stay with them. What else would you do?" Monica had grown up hearing that question, and for a long time it had seemed rhetorical. The kind of thing a good person said. Only now, sitting in her living room with a tin box open on the coffee table and a photograph of her mother at 40 in her hands, did she understand that her mother had meant it as a literal question. What else would you do? As in, what is the actual alternative? As in, name it for me, because I cannot see it. She thought about what it meant that Samuel had folded her blanket every morning, that he had washed the dishes without being asked, that he had fixed every broken thing in her apartment, not as payment but as expression, the language of a man who showed care through competence and attention, who had no other way to say what he wanted to say. She thought about the note he had left. "You gave me the feeling of having a home one more time. That is not a small thing. It is in fact everything." She thought about a door. She thought about standing in front of it in the rain, deciding whether to knock. She thought about how her mother had never, as far as Monica knew, declined to show up for someone who needed showing up for. Evelyn Hayes had had a phrase she returned to often, a thing she said in different contexts, but with the same quiet certainty. A locked door keeps you safe. An open door keeps you human. She had said it to Monica when Monica was young and did not understand it. She had said it over the years in different registers, with different emphasis. As Monica grew and began to understand it differently each time, she had said it in the hospital at the end, when she was tired and moving in and out of clarity. And Monica had held her hand and said she understood. And Evelyn had looked at her and smiled and said, "I know you do." That phrase had been in Samuel's diary, attributed not to a famous person or a book, but to a woman named Evelyn Hayes, home health aide, who had sat with his wife on the nights when Dorothy was most afraid. Richard Collins told her that Samuel had made his decision about the will 8 months before he knocked on her door. He had wanted to make sure the money went somewhere meaningful. He had trusted, in the way that people trust things they cannot fully explain, that Evelyn's daughter would know what to do with it. He had hoped, apparently, to know her before the end. He had gotten 18 days. Monica did not take the money immediately. She sat with it for a week. The way Samuel had sat with his decision for months, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. She thought about refusing it on principle, thought about it from every direction, and finally understood that refusing it would be its own kind of mistake, a misunderstanding of what it was. It was not charity. It was not payment. It was something more like the completion of a circle that had started 21 years ago in a house she had never seen, with her mother sitting beside a woman she had never met, refusing to let that woman face the dark alone. Some things needed to be completed. Some debts were not debts but something else, a passing forward, a continuation of something that didn't want to stop. She accepted it. She paid off her credit card in full. She enrolled in the nursing degree program she had been putting off for 4 years, the one that required evening classes 3 nights a week, and would take 2 years, and would change what she could do and who she could be in the building where she had already spent 11 years. She moved her mother's box down from the top of the closet and went through it properly for the first time, slowly, over a weekend, with the tin box open on the table beside her, her mother's photograph, and Dorothy's letter, and Samuel's diary, arranged in a kind of conversation that spanned 20 years and 3 people who had understood something important about how to be present for another person. She did not cry the whole time, but she cried some of it, and that was fine. The sofa was still in the living room, gray, with one arm that sat slightly lower than the other. She had not changed anything about it. She kept the blue and cream blanket folded over the back. Sometimes she sat there in the evenings before class and put her hand on the cushion where Samuel had slept. And she did not feel mournful exactly, but she felt something adjacent to it, the feeling of a presence that had passed through and left the air slightly different, the way a room feels different in the hour after someone you love has left it. She thought about the 18 days often, the way you think about a period of time that was complete in itself, that had a clear beginning and a clear end, and did not need to be extended to have meant something. 18 days was not long. She had known patients at Mercy General for 18 days, and watched them leave the ward, and carried the memory of them for years afterward. Time was not the measure of what happened in it. Her mother had known Dorothy Brooks for 8 months, and had apparently made her feel, in those 8 months, that her death was not going to be a disappearance, that she was going to pass through the hands of someone paying real attention, and that made all the difference in the world between dying and being accompanied to the edge of something. Monica understood, now, that this was the same work. Hospital ward, or living room sofa, or kitchen table in November. The same work. Be present. Notice what is broken. Stay until the fear passes. Don't make it about yourself. 6 months after Richard Collins had sat across from her with his briefcase, on a night in early May when the cold had finally and decisively left Detroit, and the city was in that brief sweet state it reached each spring, smelling of wet earth and new leaves and the particular hopefulness of a place that has survived another winter. Monica came home from her evening class at 2 in the morning. She was carrying her nursing textbooks and her bag and her thermos, and she was tired in the new way, the way of someone who is tired because they have been actively doing something rather than simply enduring it. A tiredness that felt clean and forward-facing rather than exhausting and lateral. She came up the front steps of the building and stopped. There was a young woman sitting on the top step with her knees pulled up to her chest and a backpack between her feet, and she was wearing a thin jacket that was not adequate for the night, and she was not crying and not calling attention to herself, just sitting in the patient, contracted way of someone who has run out of forward motion and is simply waiting to see what comes next. She was perhaps 20 years old. She had not looked up when Monica came up the walk. Monica stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment. The night was quiet. The street was empty. The porch light of the building was on, a warm yellow circle that reached just far enough to take in the young woman and Monica's feet and the space between them. Monica looked at her and thought about a November night 6 months ago. A man in a wet coat at her door, 3 measured taps, and a question. Is there anywhere still open tonight? She thought about Samuel folding the blanket every morning, and washing the dishes without being asked, and fixing every broken thing in the apartment, not because he owed her anything, but because it was what he had to offer, and he wanted to offer something. She thought about her mother in a room she had never seen, sitting with a woman she had never met, staying until the fear passed. Because you stayed. Because that was what you did. Because a locked door kept you safe, and an open door kept you human. She thought about the note on the kitchen table. You gave me the feeling of having a home one more time. Monica looked at the young woman on the step. She thought, She is not asking for anything. She is just here, she thought. So was he. She shifted the textbooks under her arm. She walked up the steps. The young woman looked up, startled, ready to apologize, already beginning to gather herself to move. Monica looked at her for a moment and then said, in a tone that was even and warm and not complicated by performance, "It's cold tonight. I've got a sofa if you need somewhere." The young woman looked at her. Monica said, "Just for tonight. My name's Monica." She held out her hand. The young woman's name was Destiny. She took Monica's hand. They went inside. Monica put the kettle on. She got out 2 mugs. She unfolded the blue and cream blanket and put it at the end of the sofa. She turned on the lamp, the one next to the spot where the tin box used to sit, and the apartment filled with its warm, ordinary light, the light of a place that was used, that was lived in, that was not closed. Destiny sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the steam rising from it with the concentrated attention of someone who has been cold for a long time and is relearning warmth 1 degree at a time. Monica sat across from her and did not ask any questions yet. She simply let the apartment be what it was, quiet and lit and unhurried. A place where there was no pressure to explain yourself before you were ready. She had learned this from the work. She had learned it from her mother. She had learned it from 18 days with a man who had never once made her feel observed or examined or assessed, who had simply been present in the way that the best people are present, fully and without agenda. From the window above the sink, the porch light outside was still on, the small, steady yellow circle that reached as far as it reached, and no farther, which was far enough. Evelyn Hayes had understood something that she had passed to her daughter, not by instruction but by demonstration, by the accumulated evidence of a life lived the way she lived it. She had passed it to Samuel Brooks, who had carried it through grief and loss and the slow diminishment of his circumstances without letting it become bitterness, who had knocked on a door in the rain with the last of his courtesy intact, who had left without fanfare or sentiment, who had ensured, in the careful, organized way he ensured things, that the circle would not close with him. Samuel had passed it to Monica in 18 days, and a note on a kitchen table and $45,000 and a tin box with a photograph inside. And Monica had it now, not as an obligation but as a thing she actually believed. The way you believe things that have been proven to you by experience, rather than argument. She had not chosen it intellectually. It had arrived the way convictions sometimes arrive. Through the side door, through a wet November night, and an old man's courtesy, and a handwriting slightly uneven from the tremor in his hands. It had arrived and settled, and become part of the structure of who she was now, one of the load-bearing things, something you couldn't knock out without the whole house coming down. She believed that the gesture mattered, that the impulse to open the door rather than close it, which was unreasonable and impractical, and could not be justified by a cost-benefit analysis, was also the thing that made a person continuous with the rest of humanity rather than merely adjacent to it. She believed her mother had been right. She believed Samuel had understood her mother in the way that people understand each other when they are paying real attention, not to the surface of a person but to the structure of what they value, the bones of it. She sat in the kitchen with Destiny, who was 19, as it turned out, not 20, and who had a story that was hers to carry, and that Monica did not push to hear faster than Destiny wanted to tell it. They drank tea. The apartment was warm. Outside, the porch light held its circle. The city moved around them, enormous and indifferent and full, as it always had been, of people trying to find their way to somewhere that felt like shelter, if only for the night, if only long enough to feel, just briefly, that they were not entirely alone. The sofa was ready, the blanket was folded, the door had been opened, and somewhere in that chain of small decisions made across 20 years by 3 people who had never all been in the same room, something that deserved to continue was continuing, moving forward into whatever came next, quiet and persistent and alive.